students, I am Sharon Stanley, Assistant Professor, PG Department of English, Don Bosco College, Kottayam. In this lecture, I discuss the essay Realism and Naturalism as the Expression of an Era by Richard Daniel Lehan. Considering the literary history of Europe from 1848 to 1914, we see realism, naturalism, and symbolism were the three major movements. Realism lasted approximately from 1848 to 1871, naturalism from 1871 to the early 1890s, and symbolism from about 1890 to 1914. In America, realism took hold after the Civil War and lasted until the turn of the century when it was forced to compete with literary naturalism. And literary naturalism in American fiction lasted until the end of the World War II. Later, symbolism marked the transition away from realism or naturalism toward modernism. Realism involved the literary attempt to write an objective narrative to depict the outside world as honestly and truthfully as possible. Naturalism carried realism one step further, added a biological and philosophical component to the writing of fiction, and stresses the connection between literature and science. Naturalism presumed that a theory of environment and heredity, along with Darwinian and post-Darwinian theories of evolution, would ground the literary work in a factual and scientific context. Realism was the bridge between the romance and the naturalistic novel. The realist wanted to depict the middle class reality, the life of the ordinary people, and was critical of the heightened, often symbolic, even allegorical characters who made up the romance. Considering the social background, it is evident that the death of an agrarian society and the birth of an industrial one produced a change both in the subject matter and the technique of novel. The heroic was diminished and the capacity for unqualified good was questioned. Conflict could no longer be resolved by sentiment. The banal or the ordinary competed with the extraordinary, and contradictions prevailed. Many of the new realists like Stephen Crane, Frank Norris, Harold Frederick, Theodore Dreiser, and Ernest Hemingway began as newspaper reporters. And many of the plots in this era came from events reported at length in newspaper. For instance, Dreiser's Trilogy of Desire. In America, this newspaper activity was supplemented by investigative reporting. A group of journalists reported the corruption in big business and city-state and federal politics. Their writing complemented the realist or naturalist disgust with unregulated capitalism and their sympathy for the poor. Emily Zola and Dreiser depicted the artist who could find beauty in the street. Naturalism acts as a social corrective, forcing re-evaluation of cultural truths. Practitioners or exponents of naturalism more often descended the social ladder to portray the world of the poor and the outcast, taking a stark look at what before were forbidden subjects. They portrayed poverty, alcoholism, degeneration, and the dysfunctional family. They specifically took as their subject the working class, a subject frowned on by many of the earlier novelists. They depicted sexuality with an explicitness that many readers found offensive. One of the major differences between literary realist or naturalist and the romancers who preceded them was romancers tended to set their stories in distant past, and realist or naturalist locate their tales in the more immediate historical present. Literary realist writers, they all portrayed the individual struggling for identity in a hostile society. But literary naturalism deepened this depiction by making the individual less resilient and the environment more hostile. The works of Emily Zola and Frank Norris, prominent exponents of naturalism, were sensational and extraordinary. Frank Norris insisted that terrible things had to happen in natural fiction. That means characters must be twisted away from the ordinary and brought to the edge of violence. Romanticism idealized life and valued imagination over fact, but naturalism represented life as a harsh affair. Relying on principles of objectivity based on detailed observation and insisting on the existence of external forces, especially heredity and environment, naturalism saw art emerging from life, and life ought to be the subject of art everywhere. In relating truth to empirical realm, Auguste Comte, the father of positivism, helped validate the new literary realism and later literary naturalism. The positivistic era introduced the idea that a belief should be accepted only after it had been tested empirically. The theory of degeneration also contributed influence upon realism and naturalism. Along with the idea of degeneration, the naturalists were observed the idea of a race. Darwin's theory of evolution encouraged an interest in racial identity. Realism and later naturalism depicted a conflicted reality. In ideality, the individual was free to realize his or her potential, but in reality, the large migration of people from rural areas to the city created a mob situation in which the individual found it difficult to set himself or herself apart from the crowd and usually ended up being exploited as cheap labor. Thus, there was a tension between the ideal and the real, between the expectation and reality, between promise and achievement. Thus, naturalism as a philosophy of life caught the 19th century struggle between ideal and materialistic realms. It also depicts the struggle between religion and science, aesthetics and decadence, human growth and degeneration, order and chaos, and democracy and totalitarianism. Today's assignment: write a brief note on realism and naturalism.